Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. From February to August of 2002, horrific violence held the Indian state of Gujarat clasped in an awful embrace. In that period, more than 2,000 Muslims were murdered, while state and central government officials either stood idly by, or worse, assisted the militants. Months later, India's most aggressive Hindu nationalist party was rewarded with a massive victory in Gujarat, with its largest tallies registered in the districts where the violence occurred. A careful analysis of the tragic story of Gujarat can tell us much about the nexus of political manipulation, media strategies, and ethnic violence, and how culture and development act upon each other in a democratic society. The story of Gujarat is indeed a story for the world. My guest is Arvind Rajagopal, Associate Professor in the Department of Culture and Communication at New York University. Arvind, welcome to Dialogue.
Glad to be here.
Arvind, it's, as I say, horrific but an extremely important story, and your scholarship and I imagine your eventual book is going to deal very, very forthrightly and importantly with this topic. And I think to start our story, Arvind, we almost have to begin with an incident at Godhra station on the 28th of February 2002. It's horrific itself, the fiery death of 58 people. And immediately claims of Muslim conspiracy are brought out. But I would love to get your sense of that incident, the truth or the lack of truth of those claims, and how it set off what came just after it.
Right. Well, almost soon, as soon as the event happened, the then Deputy Prime Minister L.K. Advani declared that the Inter-Services Intelligence of Pakistan had been involved in the event, and that there was a foreign hand, and there was a terrorist linkage and so forth. That there was a conspiracy, in other words. It was not spontaneous, but something planned. No evidence backing up that claim has been made clear in the years that followed. It's extraordinary that statement should have been made almost immediately. Even the claim that it was a Muslim mob that set fire deliberately to the train is unsupported by the evidence. There is no indication of any fuel having been used, any incendiary substance being put on the compartment from the outside. There doesn't seem to have been anything that went into the compartment from the outside.
Yeah, in fact, I think in your own writings, immediately after and then well into 2003, there's a substantial amount of forensic evidence indicating it was internal.
It was internal, and I understand that in closed environments where a large number of people are crammed in, there is the possibility of a combustible environment is created if a spark were to have entered. Now, it is known that the crowd outside set fire to the end of the compartment, which contains canvas, the connection between one compartment and another. So that might have done it. But at any rate, it doesn't seem to have been designed or deliberate in any sense that the deaths of these individuals was...
But we do have this extraordinary action by a government minister making this claim almost immediately upon the event.
That's
in the way that he did.
That's right. And then there was the Chief Minister, Narendra Modi, who issued instructions to all of the top bureaucratic personnel in the state that they were not to interfere in the expression of popular anger.
Or not to interfere.
Not to interfere.
That's extraordinary too.
Yes. And to assist the population in expressing their anger, the bodies were paraded. They were taken in a parade from Godhra to Gandhinagar and Ahmedabad, large crowds gathering around the wake, so to speak. And it was not surprising, especially given the history of Hindu-Muslim violence in Ahmedabad, that attacks on Muslims began thereafter.
But you know, I appreciate this because while I knew of the incident itself, of course, and what would follow all too horribly, that is rampant incitement. And
Yes.
it's officially ordained. It's ordered, isn't it, that this would take place?
Yes, and I mean, one could say that. Now, the bureaucrats, of course, have been working in an atmosphere of intimidation, and so it's been difficult to get documentation of the kind of complicity of the administration in this. However, some individuals have come out and indicated the extent of the chief minister's hand in this. R.B. Srikumar, Deputy Director General of Police in Gujarat at the time, has made statements that disclose Narendra Modi's involvement in this.
They were all too successful in this incitement, and what takes place from that point forward in the next several months up to August is in itself absolutely horrible, because from that point forward we get what amounts to the 2,000 rapes, murders, and assaults upon Muslim citizens. And do we also see during that period continued government fanning of the flames, so to speak?
There was, I mean, customarily, I mean, even in the British period, there would be police holidays when there was a sort of grace period when popular anger was allowed to be vented. And for, usually 2 or 3 days, police action was lacking, absent. Here it lasted much, much longer. And of course, there is many reports of active police participation where they fire in a mob and soften its will to resist. And then the Hindu militants would move in. In addition, where relief camps were set up, they were operating very often with very little assistance from the government, often with active, harassment, very little by way of resources provided to them, highly disparaging statements that these were baby factories, that, they ought to be wound up.
So it seems to be a government clearly desiring this kind of outcome and, of course, getting it. But Arvind, another part of the indictment, if one is to make an indictment toward those responsible for this, based upon what I've read of your writings, has to do with the press.
Yeah.
Because press coverage of these awful events, and I guess both the print and electronic media, perhaps particularly the electronic media, also play a large part in this and our full stories. How would you characterize their role?
Right. Well, the Gujarati press behaved like a Hindu press. They took up the cause of Hindu anger. For them, it was also a business proposition. If they did so, their sales would rise. If they didn't do so, their sales would be depressed. By contrast, the English language papers, the national dailies, whose branches are in Ahmedabad, for instance, their sales really came down at this time in Ahmedabad, and they had to operate under police protection.
Right.
Yes. The television stations actually were very brave in the kind of coverage that they carried out at this time. Again, they were constantly under attack. Some of them were beaten, equipment destroyed, and so forth. In India, the situation of the press is a difficult one, partly for historic reasons. We use the words press and media, and immediately we summon up a liberal history of a fourth estate, an independent watchdog. In India, such a history does not quite obtain. You have a very close linkage between the press and the state, the media and the government. So that, if you take the period of the nationalist movement, yes, there was a nationalist press, but they were not a press that then happened to be nationalist.
Yeah.
They were an activist press whose mission was the promotion of nationalism.
Yeah.
And once independence was achieved, it wasn't clear what they ought to do. Then they attached themselves to the government.
This is an extremely important point, and in fact we are going to indeed return to it as well in the course of our conversation. And also what you've said just prior to that is equally important. And it seems to me, Arvind, that just by carrying out their role whether responsibly or irresponsibly, depending upon one's views, the press did act, and here I think we get into the psychology of this, to establish perhaps a different consciousness among the people of Gujarat. That is to say, when the press reports something, particularly the television with its visual power, don't we get new facts, in a sense, leading to new interpretations? Is that part of the Gujarat tragedy?
There was a very conscious deployment of visual imagery by the government. Mm-hmm. Pictures of the burning train. There were posters plastered all over the state, buttons made with the image of the burning train. The event constantly invoked by the chief minister and other politicians. And if you read the Gujarati press, the impression you would carry away from it was that it was the Hindus that were under attack.
Yes. You know,
it was the Hindus that were under attack.
Yeah,
and numerous people I spoke to said they had no option.
Yeah.
By which they were telling me that they were part of the mobs.
You know, there is a riveting point in, again, in your writing that I actually read 2 or 3 times just to make sure and I hope I did get the gist of it correct, where, and you'll of course correct me if I am wrong, but you spoke to people in the wake of this, perhaps even months later, I'm not sure of the timing. But in any event, it was an array of people, some of them very young and highly educated. And their sense of that incident, they had no memory, yes, a sense of the persecution of Muslims during that period.
Yes, right.
But there was a concern both with Godhra itself, the Hindus that had died on the train, and then there was a temple incident, I believe, yes, after that. But this whole yes, several-month period
right,
was not a factor in their memories.
Yes, I mean, I was in New York when it happened. I went there the following year and then again for a year, the subsequent year. Mm-hmm. But several people I spoke to who were Gujarati, who were followed news in general, when I asked them, what do you think about what happened in Gujarat, they would invoke the earthquake, which had happened 2 years earlier, repeatedly, and different people. The people who died, do you mean the earthquake? Right? So, or when pressed, they would say it was this temple attack where 2 armed men shot down a number of worshippers of the temple. Violence against Muslims was registered, perceived, could be declared as such. Violence that happened due to Hindu aggression simply did not exist. It could not be spoken, did not have a name. And that structure of understanding alerted me to the fact that there is a politics of knowledge involved here, that it's not simply, A killing B, but there is a deep set of understandings which is being utilized, manipulated.
Right. It's interesting. I like that phrase, politics of knowledge, and I think it can very uncomfortably fit many other societies, including this one, where the persecution of the other is not as immediately perceptible because they are, quote, the other.
Yes, yes, yes. So there is a long-standing set of mythologies that is reproduced, which is that Muslims are violent, that they recollect the days of the Mughal Empire, they think that they really rule the land, they regard the Hindus as intruders or excrescents, and they are arrogant, they are prone to violence.
This brings us to an extremely important point, Arvind. With these mythologies, and very brutal mythologies at that, what does that tell us about the secular ideal, which we have so long associated with Indian democracy?
Well, India happens to be, with all of its problems, the world's largest democracy in which the majority of the voters, those who vote, are poor people. The educated vote in diminishing numbers and the poor vote in greater numbers with every successive election. So there is some kind of awareness about the power of the vote. Gujarat was a very brutal incident, and there have been others like it, although not on the same level. What's striking to me when I compare, say, Gujarat with Bosnia or with Rwanda, with other episodes of ethnic cleansing, genocidal violence in other parts of the world, is actually, here we find very grave levels of violence being incorporated almost as a routine into the political process. It was unusual, extraordinary, but politics carries on. The same government remains in power today. When you ask people, what was it that happened? If they are able to discuss it, they will say, the Muslims were required to be taught a lesson. We taught them a lesson. And we will have to teach them again. Yeah? But there is the sense of a finitude to the violence. Grisly and ghastly as it is, we have to grapple with this fact that democracies are mutating and transforming the meaning of the word in different parts of the world. They are not all the same as we would like them to be. Here we find in this society which was left at a very low level of development, 1947, extreme disparities between rich and poor. We find in the process of modernization, as a corporate national identity is sought to be evolved, there are high levels of structural violence, much more important.
You know, the meaning I take from this, and again, you do stop me if I, is in terms of the, if there has been this kind of activity with that kind of incorporation, if you will, into democracy, does that mean we're going to see it again and again?
I think so. I think what we have in India is the attempt after 1947 to create a very strong centralized state that would jumpstart the economy, right? Essentially inspired by the Soviet experience, where, let's recall, for all of the problems of the Soviet Union, they changed from a backward nation to one that was, the leading superpower of the world next to the United States in a matter of 4 decades. Yeah? So that experience has inspired underdeveloped countries across the world, and that meant a strong centralized state. Now, some of these lessons cannot be repeated at another point in time. They can only be imperfectly repeated, if at all. Right. So that's what we have in India, is the desire to create this strong centralized nation state, and then the discovery that, after all, it's not going to be easy, and perhaps it's not going to be possible at all. And some of this violence is an outcome of this grasping towards this ideal of a very strong centralized national identity, a shared national identity, which is not going to be possible.
On this question of national identity and the strengthening of it against all the factors that have to be contended with, what was the effect of the extraordinary period of Indira Gandhi's emergency on this question and on this issue of secularization versus other forms of ethnic identity in India?
I think the emergency of 1975-77, there was a previous one a decade earlier, is understudied and is really extremely crucial in marking a transitional point in Indian politics. We can say that until 75, it was essentially a continuation of the Nehruvian era, which was state-led developmentalism, an unquestioned reign of secularism. And secularism at this time meant that experts behind closed doors decided what kinds of affirmative action would be needed in order to keep a somewhat equal power distribution between different communities that were themselves not equal in society, right? So an active interventionist state was necessary in order to achieve this ideal of a plural democracy. In 1975, an emergency was declared essentially in order to save the Indira Gandhi government, because she was required to step down from office following a High Court order. And she declared that there was a threat to national security, that there were enemies of the nation, foreign hand at work, etc. And socialism and secularism were declared to be the watchwords of the regime that was populist in character, that would appeal to the ordinary man. There was a reinstatement of the ideals that were believed to be central to the Nehruvian Republic, and it was ruthless towards its opponents. Tens of thousands of people were jailed, habeas corpus was dropped, censorship was extreme, the press, people were terrified to disobey. And there was no protest. Substantially, it seemed like the emergency worked, which is why barely 2 years later she called for national elections, confident in the belief that she would win. because no trace of the dissent actually reached her.
You know, that's interesting to me, the absence of dissent then and later. Absence of dissent with the existence of a free press. I mean, what does that tell us about these events, every one of them, including what you just talked about in terms of the imposition of the emergency period, is remarkable for not, at least to me, drawing this kind of outrage within the press. Is that right or not right?
That's a very, very excellent question. The press is not a mirror of popular opinion. The press is a stage on which certain elements of popular opinion are enacted. It is a springboard for various kinds of political action to be authorized, initiated. But the press as a whole is not a reliable means of assessing what the people think. Immediately having said that, one can qualify it. One has to distinguish between the English language press, the Indian language press, and there's a great divide between the two. But it is, as late as 1986, there was, the total daily circulation of newspapers was 22 million, population of close to 800 million. Yeah. Today it's something like maybe 100, 150 million. But it's the educated people who read newspapers, right? And they are, even today, functional literates are a small minority. So there are other means of communication which are highly effective.
Such as?
Rumor, word of mouth, reading out aloud, or discussions in tea shops and, street corners, bazaars, saints, holy men going about in their travels and telling people about what to do, what's important. Other means of communication which time and again have proven to be politically explosive in their, their influence. And it is so, without addressing a range of different communicational modalities, no kind of politics is liable to be successful.
That is extraordinary. I mean, to me, one clear point is the press in India is clearly a different institution than it is in the West, and we have to look at its role and its role in the politicization of India in a very different way.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And part of the difficulty is that the press is constantly slipping into the conceit, which is a received conceit of the press as a fourth estate, as an independent watchdog, of having a triumphal upward trajectory into greater and greater freedom, whereas the reality is far more uneven.
If there were an interest, and perhaps there is, I can't, I don't want to sound judgmental, because the press we're talking about, I would assume, is largely a private sector enterprise.
Yes, that's right.
Can you see the need for what we might call an enlightened state policy toward the press, designed to encourage the ideal of political responsibility and such?
There's no question that policy is required, is very important. If the record of the government in enacting policies of this sort has tended to be somewhat heavy-handed, has tended to incline towards serving the interests of the government in power at the moment rather than, successive governments. The press is entirely in the private sector, I should say. There were a variety of policies. All of the big newspapers stand on land which is government-owned, and they pay, just a trifle in rent, right? They get subsidized housing, they get all kinds of perquisites. The small and medium-sized periodicals and newspapers get government grants of various sorts. And most of that, it's not clear, is well-spent money. There's been an extreme degree of insecurity attaching itself to the idea of communication and publicity. The instinct has been to control, and it is only now that it's begun to be clear with a very active private media, not only in press but also in television, that in fact there is a vibrant, viable civil society that does not require government guidelines, to be told what to do at every turn, that in fact can be relied upon to be more nationalistic than the government would could ever have dreamed it would be, right? Whip populations up into a frenzy of jingoistic euphoria. So this is what we're seeing now, is the creation of a media-sensitive middle class, which is eager to belong, eager to participate in a political community that would imagine them as actually equal.
With the power of the press, as you described it, with the power of this middle class and its ambitions, as you've just mentioned them, and with, the interests of a democracy, and not just a free press, but a responsible one, it would seem to me the preconditions for enlightened social press policy, if you will, on the part of the government do exist, that these policies could be formulated and enacted.
Yes, and if there were to be such a policy, I think one element which would be very, very critical, whose absence is very noticeable in the politics of the last decade or more, is the absence of a bilingualism
Yes.
in the approach to news coverage. Rather, we find a deeply stratified monolingual imagination, specifically the colonial history of English as a language of command, looking upon Indian society as somehow culturally out of reach, somehow something to be moved away from, to be developed out of. Whereas in the Indian language media, you obviously have a very different attitude, a different a sympathy, an intuitive proximity to Indian culture,
Right.
which is lacking in the English language media. And that set of differences is it points to a structured set of misunderstandings which is so easy to manipulate politically
Right.
that it becomes, they would rather not interfere in terms of policy.
Arvind, this look at not just the incident in Gujarat, but what it has led us into about the nature of the press in India, and perhaps in the widest compass of our conversation, the nature of democracy in India, has been extremely valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George.
I deeply appreciated it.
I appreciate it.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And Arvind, thank you for talking, man. It was marvelous. You did it again.